Okay, let's get into your life, Governor Brown.
Okay.
Okay, so I was telling Charles, it's easiest for me because I'm not that smart if we sort of go
Whatever
a
you
little
need to
bit
do, it's totally
chronologically.
fine. And it's been a while since I've had an in-person interview, so this is very fun. And,
Good.
there's always those nerves.
Yeah.
So.
Well, just tell me everything that comes to mind and we'll be fine.
Okay, perfect.
Don't
I
edit
should
or
pretend
filter.
you're like a therapist, right?
Yes, that would be great. It's just me and the whole audience behind me. Okay, so back in 2015, you at one point were still Secretary of State, and then some strange stuff started happening with the governor. Can you kind of talk through what that was like for you?
Sure. That week I was at the National Association of Secretaries of State. I had been elected the president of the association, and our conference was just beginning. Before the conference even began, I got a call from Governor Kitzhaber saying he needed to talk to me. And I said, what's the time frame? He said, basically now. So I literally hopped on an airplane and came back to Oregon.
Why wouldn't he just talk to you on the phone even?
He wanted to talk in person.
Okay.
And then we had, as you know, a relatively bizarre conversation when I got back. I arrived at the Portland airport. A security detail was there for me, and one of my staffers came, and we had a conversation. He talked about some of the work he was doing and where he wanted to go, and then he asked why I was here. I, of course, thought the conversation was a bit bizarre.
Did you think he was kidding?
I honestly didn't know what was happening at the time. So we had another conversation, a brief conversation, and then I didn't hear anything from him.
But he didn't say, I'm going to step down, so you need to be ready?
No. We obviously knew there was something going on. A couple of days later, I received the letter from Governor Kitzhaber saying he was going to resign. I believe that was a Friday. The letter said he was going to resign on the following Wednesday. So I knew at that point that I would be sworn in on the following Wednesday.
What was that like to read that letter and think, holy cow?
It was a lot. But I certainly felt like I'd been preparing for this job my whole life. I knew that the transition might be awkward. We were in the midst of a legislative session, which usually there's a lot going on. Governor Kitzhaber had created an agenda that was philosophically aligned with my values. And so we ended up meeting a few days later after the letter and had a conversation about what the transition might look like. We both care deeply about Oregon, the state that we love. And for the most part, the transition went relatively smoothly.
Was there a point, I'm just thinking if it's me, at least the next time I saw him, I'm going to say, what was the deal at the airport there, buddy?
Well, I think there was some stuff in the press about that, so I don't know. The best that I can tell at this point in time is that he had changed his mind by the time I arrived in Oregon.
Wow.
That's the best I can tell.
Yeah. But you never confronted him and say, why did you tell me to fly back?
No.
Yeah.
No.
I remember as a reporter, that was such a strange time.
It was fairly bizarre. I had left the association's meeting that I was
That you were
presiding
running.
over.
Yeah.
I was presiding over, and I was back in Oregon. And it was just awkward. It was before the days of Zoom meetings, too. I think if things had been different, we would have put me on a Zoom video and I would have been presiding over the meeting remotely, virtually. But anyway, that was 2015.
Did you at some point turn to the future first husband and say, this is going to be an interesting ride?
Yes, I did. I am very fortunate. Dan, the first man, as we like to call him, is incredibly calm. He handles stress really well and is incredibly supportive. So he has been truly magnificent through all of this.
Yeah, you are lucky to have a
I am very lucky.
good spouse. So then those early days, what was that like? All of a sudden you're walking through the hallways of the Capitol and you're not the Secretary of State, you're the governor.
Well, I certainly knew the players. I had spent 17 years in the Oregon legislature and a handful of years as Secretary of State. I knew that the legislature at the time, led by President Peter Courtney and Speaker Tina Kotek, had a handful of priorities that I was very supportive of. One of them being the legislation I had drafted as Secretary of State. That was the automatic voter registration bill. I had crafted this bill in the 2013 session. It failed on the Senate floor by 1 vote, and that's what propelled Sarah Gelser-Bluen into the Senate. She decided to run for the state Senate so she could be the 16th vote for automatic voter registration, and she was. So it was the first, if not one of the first bills that I signed, which felt really cool that I drafted this bill as Secretary of State, and as Oregon's governor, I got to sign it. But more importantly, it empowered hundreds, thousands of Oregonians in the voting process, and it has been a model for the entire country. Over 18 states have adopted some type of automatic voter registration. It has diversified in Oregon who registers to vote. We are now one of the top states for ensuring that people of color vote. And it has really brought in more younger people and more non-urban community members, which I think is incredibly important.
Yeah. And speaking of elections, I know that it must blow your mind when you see the long lines of people literally standing, waiting to vote in other states, because both Republicans and Democrats in Oregon say it's safe and it works.
It makes me crazy to watch what happens most recently in the state of Georgia, where people were lined up for hours to vote. I thought that the pandemic might make the shift to encouraging states to vote by mail, vote from home. But you know, we have folks in power. They primarily tend to be Republicans who don't want to make voting more accessible and convenient. And that's what I love about Oregon, that Democrats, that Republicans, that independents, that non-affiliateds, everyone supports making sure that voting is convenient and accessible, that it's safe and secure. And our system here is, I think, done incredibly well. It empowers and it engages Oregonians across the spectrum, and that's incredibly important.
And last question on elections. Just recently, the elections director, the second in 2 years, has announced that she's resigning. Is there a problem there? What's going on?
That's something for the Secretary of State. I will say that overseeing elections, particularly now after the Trump administration and his efforts to frankly provide false information to Americans about the integrity of our voting systems, being in elections is an incredibly tough job right now. Secretaries of State across the nation have gotten death threats. It is absolutely unacceptable. By any measure, by any account, America, and particularly Oregon, has one of the most safe and secure voting systems in the entire world. And to have folks deny the outcome of an election, particularly in a state like Oregon, where we can watch the vote count, is incredibly frustrating for these officials. And I just want to say thank you to all of them for their extraordinary service.
Okay, so there's nothing systemic wrong, it's just a really hard job?
It's a really hard job.
Yeah, okay. Moving on then, the community college shooting. You hadn't been governor for very long, and suddenly UCC happened. What was that like?
October 15th, 2015. That is a date seared in my mind. I was driving downtown. I remember exactly where I was when I got the call from my public safety advisor. I wrote down the notes. I was horrified. I got downtown, we regrouped, and I drove down to Roseburg immediately to provide whatever support, whatever assistance I could provide to this community. As you know, it's a very small community. It is a very tight-knit community, and families across the region were absolutely devastated. I will never forget comforting the families. These deaths were horrific and they were absolutely tragic. And we worked hard to make sure that there were resources that they needed. We worked with our federal partners. We wanted to make sure that the community had access to counselors to provide behavioral health support. We have worked in the years to make sure that Umpqua Community College had the resources they needed to rebuild, and it's a very important institution in that particular community. But that was a horrible, tragic event, and I will never forget meeting the families, and my heart still goes out to them to this day.
Yeah, it was awful. And as I recall, you led maybe a prayer service or a vigil, and yet I had heard that even during that there were death threats coming in to you.
Well, I have an amazing security detail, and I feel comfortable that they can protect me. I did wear a vest, a flak vest for that service, but I felt very strongly that I needed to be there in person and to send my thoughts and prayers to the community and to the region and let them know that I was going to provide the resources they needed and the support in terms of staff to help them recover and heal.
Yeah, and you think overall it went well?
I think the recovery process, it takes a very long time, particularly in smaller communities. But what I loved was anytime we asked for resources for the region after the shooting, the legislature stepped up and delivered. I was very, very pleased we were able to put together a task force with both private university presidents and public university presidents, with students, with law enforcement, and come up with recommendations that the legislature adopted, and that we have continued that work as a result of that event. My administration has really focused on tackling gun violence, and we have been able to make progress. It's not enough, but we have been able to make progress in this state since then.
Is that what spurred the state police? There's like a phone number or something where the students can talk
Yes.
about threats and stuff?
Yes, that came out of the task force.
Okay, yeah, interesting. All right. And then skipping forward, it's hard to believe that that was just 7 years ago, but it seems sometimes like a long, long time ago, but still awful. In 2020, another awful event, fires sweeping through Oregon and through entire communities. And I remember the news conference where you came to the table and said, we may have some really bad news ahead of us.
The wildfires. So what is true and what we know is that in the last handful of years, our wildfires in Oregon are different than wildfires in decades past. And I saw this in the Canyon Creek fire in 2015. We lost 55 homes there. I remember meeting a couple who had lived in their house for over 50 years and the house was burned to the ground. What do you say to people that have been through that kind of tragedy? I knew we needed to change both how we were fighting fire, but also we needed more resources. And we, at that point, after 2015, had been working with our federal partners, both Forest Service and BLM, to take a more aggressive approach to firefighting, particularly on federal lands. We also have, frankly, a really dynamic team here in Oregon. In 2019, I commissioned a wildfire council. It was an incredibly diverse council. Folks living here in Portland, folks from Baker City. It included firefighters, both structural and wildland. It included elected officials, and they came up with a series of recommendations, over 30 as I recall. And the report came out in 2019. The 2020 legislature, as you know, fell apart early on. And then we had the horrific fires of Labor Day of 2020. I again remember where I was when I got the phone call. We were over in Central Oregon. We couldn't come back through Santiam Canyon to the state capitol. We had to go all the way around. That's how bad the devastation was. And we didn't know at that time if it was going to be a couple of people who'd passed away or if we'd lost a lot. We just didn't know. They happened so quickly. And this has been the transition in fires over time. And it's partly a result of climate change. It is partly a result of our failed forest policy that kept fire off the landscape. And those fires, particularly in Southern Oregon, went so fast. We just had to get people out as quickly as possible. I did not know that how many people we're going to lose, and I was terrified. I remember the Portland Police and Fire. They couldn't get down fast enough to Southern Oregon to help out. That's how fast the fires were moving. And in the canyons, Santiam Canyon, the Mackenzie River Canyon, I literally just talked to a woman whose brother ran out. He almost died. And these were just horrific, horrific fires. After the 2020 fire, the Labor Day fires, the legislature took up the work of the Wildfire Council and passed legislation that the council had embedded into Senate Bill 762. The goal of the legislation was threefold: to make sure that we are modernizing our firefighting efforts. That means more boots on the ground, different types of equipment, and frankly, more people. One of the strategies we've used since then, since the legislation passed, is to what we call pre-position assets, making sure people and firefighting equipment are on the ground in areas where fires might occur. The second investment that was incredibly important was around creating healthier landscapes, thinning, harvest, prescriptive burning, so that our landscapes are more resilient and adaptive to wildfire. And the third investment was making sure that our communities had the tools to be more adaptive to what was happening. Ashland, a really great example. They were, as most of the valley was during the 2020 wildfires, they were inundated by smoke. Kids couldn't go out and play. Sports had to be curtailed. Runners and athletes were really limited in their outdoor activity. And frankly, anybody who had asthma or any type of lung condition was really advised not to go outside. So in Ashland, it was probably one of the worst places. They have invested in a smoke-free building, a room, where vulnerable Oregonians can go when the smoke is really bad. So that was one of the other tools, is providing resources for communities to both be better prepared and to invest in what's called defensible space, making sure that there isn't burnable material around houses. And what does that look like? So Senate Bill 762 is a game changer. I wish it would have passed prior to the Labor Day fires. It did not. But I do think it is a paradigm shift in terms of how we're tackling wildfires. I think it means that we're going to be better prepared and hopefully will mitigate the impacts of wildfire in the future.
And speaking of climate change and the state's sort of posture on things, was there a time, well, I'm thinking of the heat dome. And at least my impression up till then was the state sort of felt like, we handle the big issues and you communities, let us know if you need support, but you handle the small stuff. And the heat dome came and people died, and it seemed like there was stinging criticism of the state not doing enough, and that since then, my impression, the state has been much more leaning forward. Is that?
My heart just goes out to the families. We lost 100 Oregonians during that event. None of us, at least not in my lifetime, had ever seen an event like that, we did not know the impacts. I think it's fair to say that the state is working hard to make sure that local communities, which have the counties have their own emergency management system, are much more proactive and much more aggressive. For example, since then, I've been on the phone with the director of TriMet when we are anticipating temperatures over 100, 110 degrees, that they provide, for example, free fare for the day, so that is an air-conditioned space. But I also have to say local communities, Multnomah County, Clackamas County, Washington County, are stepping up in ways that they need to, and are doing really a tremendous job by opening up cooling centers and reaching out to vulnerable Oregonians. The other partner that's really important in all of this is our healthcare providers, the CCOs, the coordinated care organizations. I met with them after that event, and we are working to make sure they have the resources they need through the federal government to purchase things like air conditioners or heat pumps for Oregonians on the Oregon Health Plan that would prevent incidents like people dying in their homes literally from heat.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing, though, I would say about climate change. We don't know what it's going to look like, but it is here. It is in our backyards, and it is knocking at our doors. We know this. We've had an ice storm event that knocked out power in Salem and in Clackamas County for over a week. At the governor's residence, we lost power for 6.5 days. We were fortunate, we had resources. I know all the hotels in the Salem area were booked. What about the people who don't have the resources? So we are going to have to be more agile, more nimble, and more creative in the future with our emergency response, with our response to climate change, and it's getting ready for the disaster that you don't know what it's going to look like. Mm-hmm. And I am confident that the next administration will be focusing their efforts on a more resilient, a more adaptive Oregon.
Okay, excellent. What about COVID? When that first came out, I remember the headlines and people were saying this could be bad, and I was thinking, maybe it's just like the flu, maybe it's not that big a deal. What was your reaction?
I was like, we have to be ready and we have to be prepared for the worst. I have to say, though, I fear that Oregonians will remember me for COVID. It is my hope that they will remember the thousands of lives that my administration saved as a result of our actions. We declared an emergency early on. We had very tough, as you know, policies. We kept at our forefront, my administration kept at our forefront our goal, and that was to keep as many people healthy as possible and to save as many lives as possible. And by any account, Oregon certainly punched above its weight. If you look at mortality rates or COVID infections, we had throughout the entire pandemic some of the lowest rates in the entire country. But it wouldn't have happened without Oregonians coming together and doing what was right for their neighbors, for their friends, for their community members, and for vulnerable Oregonians. So it was truly a team effort, and Team Oregon did really well under the circumstances.
Although along the way, you shut down schools, businesses, required people to wear a mask, and ticked off a whole lot of folks.
I know that my actions did not make a lot of people happy. My goal was to keep people alive, and we did that.
What's it like in the middle, though, feeling in your heart of hearts that you are doing the right thing? You're the adult in the room, perhaps, and getting criticism from all sides.
It's interesting that you asked that. I'm going to share a couple of moments. One, I had a conversation with Governor Jay Inslee early on, and I wrote it on a note. I hope I have the note somewhere. He said basically, it doesn't matter what you do. People are going to be unhappy, so do the right thing. And that's what we did. The other moment I remember, and we were truly, Pat, it has been 100 years since we've had a global pandemic like this that has impacted the United States of America. The Spanish flu, 1918. There was no playbook. We were literally building the airplane while we were in the air. So we had very key goals: keep people alive and healthy to the extent possible, use data and science to inform your decision making, and I think those played out well. If you look at what happened along the West Coast, we were pretty much aligned in our actions. There may have been a couple of days difference. I received a lot of criticism for not shutting down the state soon enough. I received a lot of criticism for shutting down the state. That told me we were about in the right place. But Oregon had an interesting dynamic that other states didn't have. And that is because of our focus, because of our efforts to make sure that people had access to health care, we have the lowest hospital bed capacity in the entire country. So, for example, early on we brought a tent and got the Oregon State Fairgrounds set up to be a hospital in case we needed it. But we didn't have a lot of beds, and we had to preserve those beds for our most vulnerable Oregonians. But the memory that really sticks out in my mind is the time I realized that our nation, that these United States of America, led at the time by Donald Trump, that we did not have any more PPE, personal protective equipment. And Oregon was basically on its own, that we were going to have to create it, we were going to have to produce it, we were going to have to build it, we were going to have to figure it out. And that's what my team and I did. We had multiple companies helping, from very large, like Nike, to very small. It was truly everyone coming together to figure out how we were going to protect our frontline workers and how we're going to protect our vulnerable Oregonians.
It's an amazing thing not to have masks for hospital workers.
The stories from the nurses were just really frightening, absolutely frightening. But I also remember going on to the ICU unit at OHSU and seeing the sick people there. We were all masked up, all gowned up. There were 2 people under the age of 40 on ECMO machines. One of the physicians told me a story. They had 1 ECMO machine left, and they had to choose between 2 30-year-olds who was going to get it. And being on an ECMO machine didn't mean you were going to live. It just meant you were less likely to die. The horrific decisions our medical providers, our doctors, our nurses, our PAs had to make were absolutely devastating for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any regrets, decisions you would not have made if you had to do it again?
COVID?
Yeah.
No. No.
Slept well, you were doing the right thing.
No, I did not sleep well. But I'm not going to Monday morning quarterback that pandemic. I think history will prove me right, that we did the right things, we had the right priorities, and that we worked hard to do the most good for the most number of Oregonians.
Very well. Okay, moving on to the environment. Well, wait, because that'll be a big one. Before that, speaking of hospitals and Salem and all that,
yes,
we've been doing a lot of stories on mental health. And a lot of our viewers have written in and said, there's no room for these people. Why doesn't the state just build another state mental hospital? What do you think of that idea?
Well, I have been working in the behavioral health for many years. I spent 10 years working to pass mental health parity. It finally passed in my time in the state Senate. The bill required that behavioral health conditions, mental health conditions, would be treated like any other physical condition, for insurance purposes. It took 10 years for Oregon to pass that bill. That's appalling to me. But at the same time, we were also moving to deinstitutionalize folks in institutions. And the goal was to move money from a very large hospital where people would live for months or years to the communities where they would get culturally appropriate care that would best meet their needs.
So you're talking about Damish?
Yes.
And were you a state lawmaker then?
I believe so.
Okay.
I believe so.
Because I'm curious, it's hard to find people that will talk through what the decision making
But,
was.
and I don't remember the exact timeline, I'd have to look it up. But the goal in closing Damish was to move resources to the community. But you know what happened. Resources did not go to the community.
Yeah.
So we have struggled in this arena. I'm really pleased to work with legislators like Representative Rob Noce and Senator Kate Lieber. Their work created a $500 million package that we would invest in behavioral health resources in our communities across the state. It would also help, and we are doing this through Future Ready Oregon, invest in training culturally responsive healthcare providers, particularly in the behavioral health space. That is the work we need more of, and that needs to be happening in our communities. Do I think we need more beds? Absolutely, but I'm not sure institutionalization is the way of the future.
What's wrong with that?
It's expensive, and it may not be the best care for individual Oregonians.
I can just hear viewers saying, I'll bet it's better than them living on the street.
Anything's better than folks living on the streets. But we're talking how many folks are on the streets right now in any day throughout the state of Oregon? It's thousands.
It'd be hard to build a hospital that big.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And not all of them have behavioral health issues.
Yeah, I understand. And then finally, before we go away from behavioral health, there's been discussion about the commitment law, that the threshold is maybe too high. What do you think? Should the bar be lowered a little bit on that?
What is different about the work we're doing, both in terms of behavioral health and substance abuse disorder, is that we are bringing to the table the folks who are struggling with these issues, that have lived experiences with mental health issues or substance abuse, and what it is they need and how treatment could heal them in a way that is more reflective and responsive to their needs. That is something that's relatively new. And so the conversation I think that needs to happen in community is conversations with folks about what that treatment looks like, what that service and support is, and what folks need. Here's what we do know. We know that supportive housing works. And this is a great example that the state has invested in over the last several years. And that is housing, good bed, clean running water, all that good stuff. But on the bottom of the building, you include, for example, treatment, behavioral health, and substance abuse treatment. You include the opportunity to pick up skills for employment. You include daycare. You provide all of the services needed for the folks that are struggling right there. And we know that works. We need more of it. We absolutely do.
And I know you're not trying to avoid the question, but again, is the bar too low or too high on committing people against their will?
Senator Brzezinski has been looking at this issue for a couple of years now. I would honestly want to spend a lot more time studying it before I can make that assessment. I have folks that are doing this work that I know in the Multnomah County Courthouse, judges who've been doing this work for years. I would want to have in-depth conversations with them. I would want to talk with people who've had lived experiences and see what it's like for them. One of the issues, if you talk to anyone who's involved in the treatment space, the entire spectrum of behavioral health and substance abuse disorder, is that we need to have more treatment providers that reflect the diversity of our community, and that has been a challenge. So I would want to have all of those conversations, and I'm hoping that is what is happening with the leaders on the ground right now.
All right, fair enough. Thank you very much. Okay, we're getting close.
I think we're fine.
We're fine?
We're okay time-wise, aren't we? Okay.
Oh,
All right.
Then I'll have a sip of water.
Have a sip of water.
Because next, I want to talk about tolling.
Ha!
Tolling is coming to Oregon. A lot of people are surprised as we're reporting about it because they lost track that in 2017, I think the legislature approved that. And there's a lot of concern that once it comes, it will never leave, which I think is probably right, because the Department of Transportation needs to have some money coming into its budget. So where are you with tolling?
Well, I understand that nobody likes tolling. I am well aware. I don't like it either. But as you just said, it is a key way to pay for the investments we need in infrastructure to get people where they need to go safely. And so the legislature made a decision in the Transportation and Jobs Act of 2017 to move forward with tolling, and I supported that decision. And I think there needs to be two key things that happen as a result. Number one, community engagement. There needs to be more conversation with the communities impacted. For example, West Lynn, because of the Abernathy Bridge. You're probably aware that the state of Washington's not very excited about tolling either. So there obviously needs to have more conversation in the Portland area about what that will look like. But the second piece, and this is incredibly important, that any type of funding approach has to center equity. We need to make sure that the communities that have been historically disenfranchised, our communities of color, our low-income families, our rural communities, have a voice and are least impacted by this work. I'll just share one other piece. Really proud that we were able to come together around the Rose Quarter and a plan for the Rose Quarter that will hopefully begin to right the historic wrongs that occurred when I-5 went through the Albina neighborhood and devastated that Black community. I think it's so important. We have a project on the table that could help repair the injustices that occurred over 50 years ago and bring that community back together. I think it's absolutely key that the legislature, that the next administration, and frankly, in strong partnership with our federal partners, invest in that project and make it a dream come true. That's the other piece is we have this amazing opportunity to make significant investments in infrastructure, making sure that we are seismic resilient, that we are more climate friendly, and we can do it by leveraging federal dollars that will be available through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have an incredible opportunity to make significant investments that will heal communities, that will reduce carbon emissions, and that will ensure we are more earthquake resilient in the future, and we shouldn't lose this opportunity.
All right then. Well, that brings us to cap and trade. That was an interesting battle in the legislature, a couple of sessions. And so we saw it unprecedented with the Republicans. Actually, it wasn't unprecedented, as you well know, because I believe that Kate Brown at one point led a walkout.
No, I didn't.
No?
I was in the House, I was in the Senate, but good, close.
Darn it.
No.
But what was that like when the Republicans walked out? That must have been very frustrating.
Well, there is a ballot measure that passed in November overwhelmingly that ensures, I think, that let me try that again. There is a ballot measure that passed in November overwhelmingly that will ensure neither party will walk out again. And I think what that will do, I hope what that will do, is force people to the table to continue to have conversations and to do things the Oregon way, which I think makes the most sense. But go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but at the time, the Republicans said the Oregon way was the Democrats ramming this down our throat.
The Democrats were in the majority at the time, and they were well aware that the climate change, that the impacts of climate change are impacting all of us, that they are disproportionately, let me try that again, climate change is disproportionately impacting rural communities, communities of color, and low-income families. And we know from the climate change events that we have seen that these groups have been disproportionately impacted. And honestly, they had no other proposal. And so we have been working steadily to tackle and to address the results of climate change. I mentioned the work we have done around wildfire and forest policy, but let me tell you a couple of other bills.
Okay, but before we get too far in the weeds,
Yes.
because you have a great brain and you're very deep in all of this, but when you say the Republicans had no other plan, basically are you saying that their answer to any of this was no and still no?
Yes.
And that was it?
Yes.
So when they complained about not being consulted enough, they were consulted and they had nothing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We had meeting after meeting, there's no question. I'll remember specifically one Republican member put a carbon tax on the table. But of course, when we had serious conversations about that, they walked away from that as well. So there were in-depth conversations. And I have prided my administration and my work on doing things the Oregon way. And I think I've been criticized, frankly, for being too collaborative. We worked very hard to address the concerns that conservatives had. What is clear is that they did not want us to take that path. So we've had to take it in other ways. Because as I said earlier, climate change is at the door. It is here now. Let me give you a couple of examples where we've truly centered our historically underserved communities. One is around water. We have created a 100-year water vision, a strategy to make sure that we have the right governance, the right funding, and the right community engagement to make sure that local communities can invest in both the natural and built environment for water storage. We are seeing the impacts of drought and the impacts of climate change, particularly, for example, in the Klamath Basin. I will just say, as a side note, around water strategy, this is a 100-year plan. One of the tribal chairs, Kat Brigham, she's chair of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, she said, why only 100 years? We plan for the next seven generations. Wow. So that told us the 100-year strategy was good. In Klamath Basin, in the last 2 years, they've had 480 residential homes run out of water. So we had to invest both in hauling water. We are investing at my request. The E-Board invested in a well drilling program at Klamath Community College.
Because there's not enough well drillers.
There's not enough well drillers. Yeah. That's the level of involvement that the state has had to support the community and partner with the county, because we want these residents to have clean, safe drinking water, but we also want them to be able to cook and, of course, to take showers. So water is incredibly important, and we have made significant investments there, more work to do. In terms of tackling carbon emissions, we have what I would consider a comprehensive strategy. Number one, we have put our low income and our communities of color at the forefront of that work. Oregon was the first state in the entire country to provide rebates for electric vehicles for new and used vehicles. And our approach was rubber stamped, so to speak, by Congress when the Inflation Reduction Act took that same approach. We have moved to 100% clean energy by 2040, one of the most aggressive timelines in the country, and we have capped carbon emissions, and we're doing that through a collaborative regulatory approach. Would I have rather we had a cap and invest so we could have more resources to invest in these communities? Absolutely, but that didn't happen. And so we have the executive order, the approach that I let folks know I would take if the bill did not pass, even though we had the votes, and the approach that I did take because we needed to take action. As you know, we are not doing enough in this state, in this country, and in this world to tackle climate change. And we have to do everything possible to preserve the beauty and bounty of Oregon for generations to come.
And I know that it's a long-term vision, and I imagine there was some relief when Tina Kotek was elected, because if the other two were elected, they were going to dismantle that.
I am confident that the next administration will take the baton and run even further in terms of tackling climate change.
Okay, excellent. Oh
my God, what haven't we talked about? Future Ready Oregon. Reproductive health equity. So,
okay.
and racial justice. Let me do a couple quick things.
Oh,
One,
boy.
We talked COVID. We talked future. We haven't talked two things that I was instrumental in. Okay.
Very well.
COVID, obviously, not to my choosing.
Yeah, you want to talk about that again?
Two other things where my team and I basically set the table. Number one, judicial appointments. I have appointed 105 judges to the Oregon bench, 52 of them women, 26 people of color, and 8 from the LGBTQIA community. That is a significant shift in who will be serving on the bench in terms of diversity. Those decisions that these judges will make will have an impact, a positive impact on Oregonians' lives for decades to come. I've been blessed, of course, because I think I'm the tail end of the baby boomer, and many of them are retiring baby boomers. So it truly will be a generational shift on our courts. Justice Adrienne Nelson is the first Black person to ever serve on a state appellate court in Oregon. And she has brought such heart and such soul to that work. It's truly extraordinary. She, as you know, is in line for another appointment. So we'll see what happens.
To become one of the Supremes?
I think it'll be a federal.
Oh,
a federal
that's
appointment.
Right, that's right.
A federal appointment, yes.
So you're going to lose her?
Yes, yes. But that's 39 to deal with. The 39th governor that's a 23 problem. The other piece that I am really, really proud of is my work around racial justice. And one of the things that the George Floyd murder did was crystallize our work. I've been working with my DEI coordinator, Sapor Chang at the time, trying to look at states and cities that have really made a paradigm shift into centering the voices of our Black and our brown and our Indigenous communities. George Floyd got murdered, and that shifted our thinking immediately. We created the Racial Justice Council. We had hundreds of Oregonians step up for this work, and it has truly shifted my thinking as I developed my governor's legislative agenda for the last couple of sessions. And it has also shifted, I hope, how state agencies work with community. And I think you are going to see the lasting impacts of that work. Will we dismantle racism overnight? Absolutely not. But the Racial Justice Council has made good, solid strides toward deconstructing racism. And so I'm really proud of that work.
Are there 2 or 3 examples that you can point out?
Yes, the RJC Health Committee introduced legislation to cover all people, to ensure that regardless of your immigration status or where you came from, you would have access to health care. That legislation was passed in the 21 session. And I think the work around criminal justice reform has had a really strong impact. The commission, the council, invested in community projects through the Criminal Justice Council, and I believe that those dollars will go toward preventing the kind of crime that we see in the future.
I have no idea what that means.
I don't either. I just was like, I couldn't think of the bill.
That's okay.
I can't think of another one. Another example off the top of my head. RJC, you guys.
What about marijuana pardons? Is that one?
Oh. The Racial Justice Council was fairly adamant that we lost our camera guy.
I think it's still rolling.
Okay, all right, okay. Pat becomes a cameraman. It's still rolling?
Yeah, I think it is, yeah.
Okay. The RJC, the Racial Justice Council, which got codified into state law, was adamant that we move forward on the pardons around marijuana. And so at their urging, I was very pleased to issue pardons for 47,000 Oregonians that had marijuana convictions for less than 1 ounce in their past.
It's a big number.
It's a big number.
Which reminds me, though, you also caught some flack for reducing sentences of kids that had been convicted, I believe, of violent crimes.
So over time, you might recall ballot measure 11. That was a one-size-fits-all approach. And the impact of ballot measure 11 has been incredibly devastating on communities of color. I don't think it would surprise you to learn that not the majority, but certainly disproportionately, the young people locked up by ballot measure 11 were Black and brown. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed a bill, Senate Bill 1008, and that was legislation promoted by Senator Jackie Winters. She was Black and a Republican, and she believed very strongly in second chances, as do most Oregonians. The problem with ballot measure 11 is that we locked up young people who committed crimes for an entire lifetime. And what we now know is that young people who commit crimes can change. They can be rehabilitated, they can be reformed, they can achieve remarkable things in their communities. So I moved forward and Senate Bill 1008 was prospective. Based on my reading of the law, I made the decision to apply it retroactively to some of the juveniles who had been committed of crimes under ballot measure 11.
Still feel good about that decision?
The vast majority of those young people will go before the parole board, and the parole board will make the decision about whether they are entitled to be released or not. And the young people that I have seen, first of all, most of them have been through extraordinarily horrific tragedies as a child. In addition to being sexually or physically abused, they were emotionally abused. Their parents or whoever was raising them asked them to start selling drugs or to be a prostitute. They were given drugs at early ages. Many of these kids went through horrific childhoods. And the cases that I've seen, these young people have achieved despite their past, despite their actions, have achieved amazing things, from educational to treatment and giving back to their communities. Really extraordinary impacts. My number one goal in making those decisions is making sure that the public is safe. My second goal is to make sure that the victims have input. My third goal is to make sure that any offender has been rehabilitated, has remorse, and has been held accountable for their actions.
All right then. Shifting to politics for just a second.
Just want to flag, the governor does have a 12:30.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh my God.
Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Okay.
We'll have to have you over on the back deck and
Okay.
chat more. I was just going to ask about the candidates, even Tina Kotek, sort of running away from Kate Brown. I'm not Kate Brown. What was that like for you to hear that?
Look, I am really proud of the work that my administration has done. My goal was to make Oregon a better place for everyone and ensure that Oregon is a place where all of our children can thrive. So I am very pleased and proud of my administration, and I am confident that I will be handing the baton off to the Kotek administration, and she will competently lead the state. My administration has centered our historically underserved communities. We have worked to make sure that our communities that have been devastated by the pandemic, by wildfire.
This is a beautiful answer, Governor. But it's on my show, it's what we call a pivot. Because the question was, what was it like to hear the candidates for governor saying, I'm not Kate Brown?
I'm really proud that I've had this opportunity to lead Oregon through one of the most difficult times, and I'm really grateful that the voters of Oregon have given me this chance. It's been a true honor and a privilege.
All right, what's next for you? Do you have time for that?
What's next for me? I know this won't surprise you, but Dan and I are going to take a vacation, and then I'll come back and figure out what the next chapter is. I honestly hope that it will continue, that I will continue in public service in some way, shape, or form, but I don't know what that looks like yet.
Gonna take a big sigh? Just,
Governor Sandoval, who was former governor of Nevada, he said, this is like wearing a 50-pound flak jacket and you have it on all the time. I'll be taking off that flak jacket on January 9th at about noon. So we'll see.
yeah, I was wondering if you were gonna use the Barbara Roberts quote as well, about the feather duster.
That is actually Governor Atiyah's quote, but she uses it and she attributes it to Governor Atiyah. He said, you arrive on inauguration day a peacock and you leave a feather duster.
Does that feel about right?
I think it'll be about right. Governor Kulongoski said to me, he said, literally, your security detail leaves you and goes to the next governor. And he said, I didn't have a ride home. And I said that to one of my security detail, and he said, oh, Governor, I'll give you a ride home.
That's nice.
Wasn't that sweet?
Very nice, yes.
All right.
We've taken enough of your time.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If we can just have our microphone back, then we'll...
No, you can't. I'm going to keep it forever.